Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I'm doing a video response to Prof MTH, who is a user here on YouTube that I subscribe to. I want to note that Wayman29, I believe, is also going to be doing a video response. We discussed this video, the video made by Prof MTH, his video entitled A Deeper Meaning. And we were discussing the video and thought that we would both do a video response, and so I think Wayman is going to make his video later today, maybe tomorrow, but we may overlap with each other, and so we'll see how much ground between the two of us we can cover. I'm going to link the Prof's, I'm going to call him Prof for short, Prof's video in the description section, so for those of you who want to watch it can watch it. It's an interesting video. He's making a video response to himself. He made a video called Original Sin, I believe, where he was discussing the concept of original sin in Christian theology. And in this video, he's referring to comments he's been getting from Christians about Adam and Eve in the story in Genesis, where a lot of Christians apparently were saying that they really don't read Genesis literally. They read it as an allegory or a metaphor. They're not concerned with the historicity. And he had a hard time understanding what Christians were talking about. What does it mean to say that you take this metaphorically? He then brought up Paul's letter in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 22 through 23, where Paul seems to be, and this is something that Prof, he interprets it this way. He says that Paul is indicating that Adam and Jesus are both historical people, and mainly because it says that it mentions Adam being the one who dies, and then there's sin and death, and then Jesus is the person who dies, and there's resurrection, there's life through him. And so, from his perspective, Paul must have thought that Jesus was a historical person, and if he thought Jesus was a historical person, then therefore Adam must have been a historical person. So if Christians want to interpret Genesis metaphorically, what are they going to do with this statement by Paul? Now, there's a couple points I want to make before bringing up the explaining why people can believe Genesis is a metaphor. I want to bring up two statements. One, first, how do we know Paul's mind? We don't know if Paul actually believed that Jesus was a historical person. This is just me playing devil's advocate here. This is something that we can just consider. I'm not really trying to prove anything except that people can have a allegorical view of these topics. Mainly that Paul never met Jesus. He saw Jesus in a vision. This was a personal, spiritual, psychological, subjective experience that he had. And in having this experience, he never knew if Jesus was a real person until he met up with the disciples. Now, that means that Paul, and we know this from his letters, never spoke about Jesus with detail about his life. Paul doesn't really seem to care about the details of Jesus' life. The only thing he cares about was what Jesus stands for, as a symbol of paying for the sins of mankind and leading people into eternal salvation. That's all Jesus is to Paul. Because Paul never talks about the life of Jesus. Because Paul never knew Jesus, and even if we do believe that he met the disciples and knew the disciples, he doesn't really seem to care either way about Jesus' actual historical life. The only thing he gets close to is he calls him the seed of David. That's about it, from my understanding. So, really, he's talking about Jesus in very spiritual, theological ways, and one could argue that they are symbolic. Now, the other thing I want to point out is the author of the letters that are attributed to Paul. How do we know that those are meant to be read literally? How do we know that the New Testament is supposed to be read literally? We are only told this by Christians who tell us that we're supposed to read it literally. But if we want to read it metaphorically, who's to say that we are wrong in this regard? Those are my 2 points of playing devil's advocate. Now, the third option is, let's say someone wants to take Genesis metaphorically. Now, Prof, you did bring up an interesting point. I would be curious to see what Christians have to say to answer your question, as far as if you take Paul literally in 1 Corinthians, then how do you, one would basically be forced, a Christian would be forced into two perspectives if they do read Paul literally. One, they would have to accept that Jesus is a historical person and by default accept Adam. Or two, they would have to accept that Jesus is also a metaphor. and so is Adam. Now, to a lot of Orthodox Christians, this would seem like heresy. How can one say that Jesus is also a metaphor? Well, I have a couple books here that I'd like to read some sections from. One is Joseph Campbell's book, Thou Art That, which is the subtitle is Transforming Religious Metaphor. And in this book, he talks about Genesis. And I want to read his section on Genesis. So starting on page 49. By the way, the chapter is Symbols of the Judeo-Christian Tradition, page 49. Genesis. It is very interesting to note in chapters 5 and 6 of Genesis how the priests worked out the relationship between the Mesopotamian kings who lived from the period 43,200 years and the 10 Jewish patriarchs. They thereby united the two mythologies of Yahweh and of the mathematically worked out cycle of time. The first part of the book of Genesis is sheer mythology, and it is largely that of the Mesopotamian people. Here we have the Garden of Eden, for this is the mythological age in which we enter a mythological garden. The story about eating the apple of the forbidden tree is an old folklore motif that is called the one forbidden thing. Do not open this door, do not look over here, do not eat this food. If you want to understand why God would have done a thing like that, all you need to do is tell somebody, don't do this. Human nature will do the rest. God's idea in this story was to get Adam and Eve out of the garden. What was it about the garden? It was a place of oneness, of unity, of no divisions in the nature of people or things. When you eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, however, you know about pairs of opposites, which include not only good and evil, light and dark, right and wrong, but male and female, and God and man as well. Man has eaten the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Lest he eat the fruit of the second tree, which is that of immortal life, God throws man out of the garden, places two cherubim with a flaming sword between them to guard the gate. Adam and Eve are separated from God, and they are aware of this break in their sense of oneness. They seek to cover their nakedness. The question becomes, how do they get back into the garden? To understand this mystery, we must forget all about judging and ethics and forget good and evil as well. Jesus says, judge not, that you may not be judged. That is the way back into the garden. You must live on two levels. One, out of the recognition of life as it is without judging it, and the other by living in terms of the ethical value of one's culture, one's particular personal religion. These are not easy tasks. I said that God exiled Adam and Eve from the garden, but actually they exiled themselves. The story yields its meaning only to a psychological interpretation. If you explain it in a historical event that occurred at some distant time back there, it seems ridiculous. There was no Garden of Eden as a concrete place. To believe so is to misunderstand and misconstrue the metaphorical language of religion. You cannot even find a date for the idea of it. In the evolution of the species, did it arise with Homo erectus when the human brain measured 1,000 cubic centimeters? Or did it come later with Neanderthal man, or just prehistoric with Cro-Magnon? When did this notion come? This idyllic spot is not a historical fact. The garden is a metaphor for the following. Our minds and our thinking in terms of pair of opposites, man and woman, good and evil, are as holy as that of God. Let us look around this garden, now that we stand imaginatively within it. What is the tree of immortal life? Even after examining in depth the rabbinical discussions of the two trees in the garden, it remains something of an enigma. Look closely and you may see, as I do, that they are the same tree. You are in the garden, the tree is the way out. The way out is through learning of good and evil, a process that is symbolically expressed by eating the fruit of that tree. It is as if you are walking from a room where all is one into a room where, as you pass the threshold, all is suddenly two. Look back at the gate of the garden, where stand the two cherubim with a flaming sword between them, and you are out in exile from the place where all was one. What is the way back? The idea appears to be that God is keeping us out of the garden, forbidding our re-entry. In the Buddhist tradition, however, the Buddha says, don't be afraid, come right through. But what does that mean? Of the two guardians in the Buddhist theme, one has his mouth open, the other has his mouth closed. They are opposites. One represents fear, the other represents desire. The fear is that of death, and the desire is for more of this world. Fear and desire are what keep you out of the garden. It is not God who keeps us in exile, but ourselves. What then is the way back into the garden? One must overcome the fear and desire. Regard the lilies of the field, Jesus teaches. They toil not, neither do they spin. Blake in his Marriage of Heaven and Hell says in effect, remove the cherubim from the gate, and you will see that everything is infinite. You'll clean desire and fear from your eyes, and will behold everything as a revelation of the divine. All this teaching is right here before us. In the Gospel of Thomas, which we find in the Nag Hammadi jars dug out of the Egyptian temple, Jesus says, people ask, when will the kingdom come? And Jesus says, in an example of sheer Gnosticism, the kingdom will not come by expectation. The kingdom of the Father is spread upon the earth, and men do not see it. That is what the story of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden is all about. It's not about an historical incident, but about a psychological, spiritual experience and metaphor from what is happening to us right now. The story of the fall and the exile from the Garden of Eden is one of the two creation stories in the book of Genesis, the older of the two. God had a garden, the story tells us, because he needed a garden. This theme dates back to old Sumer. In their stories, the gods grew weary of tilling the fields and feeding themselves. They created the human race to till the fields for them. So the gods have a garden, and they ask of man what he is going to do besides tend this garden. Then God makes animals and brings them up for man to name them. But merely naming the animals is hardly enough activity for a man. God has this marvelous idea of putting Adam to sleep and bringing forth from his side what Joyce calls the cutlet-sized consort. That is a myth motif from a period around the 9th century BC. In the Indian Upanishads, the same story is found, but with a difference. That which is transcendent forms itself and knows its own existence. It says, I, aha. But no sooner has it become self-conscious than it is afraid. It experiences fear. Then it thinks, for such as God is in it, of what should I be afraid? I am the only thing there is. Then it thinks, I wish I weren't alone. And it swells up, splits in half, and becomes male and female. The male then begets the human race on the female. She thinks, how could he join with me when we are aware of the same substance? When we are of the same substance, excuse me. She turns herself into a cow, and he turns himself into a bull, and then she into a mare, and he into a horse, and so is created the whole world. He then looks around and says, I have poured this forth. The world is God. Now the difference between that and the biblical account is that God does not divide himself. Rather, he cuts Adam in half. And you might say in the creation of Eve, these are two readings of the very same symbol. This twice read symbol here has its origin in a common mythology. Turn to the Symposium of Plato, which is about 400 years later, and one finds that marvelous story of the people who were like two people. That is, each one has 4 arms, 4 legs, and they went on. The 3 kind of them existed: male, male, female, female, and male, female. The gods then became unhappy about them, betrayed them, and Zeus and Apollo cut them up in half and turned their heads around so they both looked the same way. The place where the two had been joined was pulled together and is recognized now as the navel. However, all that these creatures did was embrace each other, longing to be one again, and in effect the gods thought, we'll never get any work done this way. So they separated them and put one over there and the other over here, with each looking from the other one. This is a common myth with a single motif that is found in parts of the world at a time. In that time, it is a myth of the original androgyne. In the Kabbalah, one reads that if you live a moral life, that is to say, if your mind is in the right place and you are not a sensual person, then the person that you marry will be that one that is your other half. God himself is male and female. The names given to God combine those male-female elements, that is, the notion of a separation and a bringing together. These mythic themes can be regarded as just fairy tales, or they can become illuminated for your life. And all this symbolism is in the Genesis text when it is read in terms of its connotation. That is the true metaphorical meaning that gives us its spiritual message and significance. The first chapter of Genesis, as much as later texts, describes a different creation altogether. This text is post-Ezra, and it is after the exile in Babylon and the return to Jerusalem. Here God creates by the word. There is, we must remember, an Egyptian text in which God creates by uttering every creation. He brings forth with just a word. That notion of the word as a sexual symbol is intended. The teeth are the vagina and the tongue is the phallus, and out of this forming words together all the gods, the heavens, and the world are brought forth. That is the God who creates in the first chapter of the Old Testament. There too, the Cain and Abel story is probably a transformation of the first murder or separation out of which everything comes. And another book that I have just as a reference, An Order Outside of Time, A Jungian View of the Higher Self from Egypt to Christ by Robert B. Clark. In this book, he talks about biblical myths in relationship to other myths. And Carl Jung, in analytical psychology, views Christ as a symbol of the self. This idea that there is the death and resurrection means that you die from an older self and you become something new. There is this progress through life's journey of becoming a whole individual person, and that's the meaning of death and resurrection. So indeed we find that people can interpret these symbols, these persons, on a metaphorical, psychological level, and that is the option that people have. Thank you for watching. Peace.